Study what we taught on the feast, and you remember there were 3 annual feasts that were required. It was required of all the males to come up to the 3 annual feasts, but it doesn't say that of the females. Verses 20 and 21, they go ahead and obtain some more children. Let's see, I'm looking for something else. Yes, verse 27, we have one of those unnamed prophets that we've talked about before. Samuel, remember, is the beginning of the regular order of prophets. We gave you last time some of the ones, such as Abel and Enoch and Moses, prophets that we've seen come beforehand. There was an unnamed prophet in Judges chapter 6 that spoke to the people of Israel at that time. And here in verse 27, we have another of these unnamed prophets. So there were a few prophets, not very many, but there were a few prophets that lived in the land at this time. Now this is simply what the phrase a man of God means. Whenever it calls him a man of God, it always in the Old Testament means a prophet. There came a man of God unto Eli, and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Did I plainly appear unto thy house, unto the house of thy father, when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? And did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? And did I give unto the house of thy father all the offerings made by fire of the children of Israel? Then wherefore kick ye at my sacrifice, and at mine offering, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honorest thy sons above me, to make yourselves fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel my people? Wherefore the Lord God of Israel saith, I said indeed that thy house and the house of thy father should walk before me forever. But now the Lord saith, Be it far from me. For them that honor me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days come, 1 Kings 2 is when the days come, that I will cut off thine arm and the arm of thy father's house, that there shall not be an old man in thy house. Now, what is interesting about Eli, we have to go back. Now, he's a priest, and we see in verses 27 and 28, the man of God or the prophet is obviously talking about Aaron, because Aaron was the beginning of the priesthood. Remember, Aaron had 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. The first 2 sons, the oldest 2, Nadab and Abihu, die in Leviticus chapter 10 because of the strange fire they offered to the Lord. That leaves the 3rd born, Eleazar, and the 4th born, Ithamar, to be priests under their father Aaron, who is the high priest. Now, whenever Aaron dies in Numbers chapter 20, who becomes high priest then? Eleazar becomes high priest. And remember, it goes down, the priesthood goes down generally to the oldest son of the high priest, then his oldest son. The other ones will become priests. His oldest son or firstborn will become the high priest. Now, we don't get this in the Samuel's account. We do get this over in the genealogy of Chronicles. Guess who Eli is descended from? Ithamar. This is one of those things that's completely unexplained and completely unexplainable in the Bible. We have no hint whatsoever on when or why the priesthood, the high priesthood, changed from the family of Eleazar to the family of Ithamar. It did sometime earlier in their history. In other words, sometime between the time of Eleazar and the time of Eli, the priesthood, the high priesthood, switched from the family of Eleazar to the family of Ithamar, because Eli is a descendant from Ithamar rather than Eleazar. Now, that's something you don't get here, but you get in later books, as I said. Why? We're not told why. How? When? We're not told that either. So that's something that simply can't be explained. But notice what God does say in verse 31. There's going to come a day that I'm going to cut off the arm of your father's house. In another place, let's see, he goes on down in verse 34 to give him a sign of this. This shall be a sign unto thee that shall come upon thy 2 sons, on Hophni and Phinehas. In one day they shall die, both of them. And of course, Eli dies the same day. Eli and his 2 sons all die on the same day. Now, if that takes place, then obviously, look, we don't have any more descendants to come from Eli for the priesthood. However, it's not changed back over to the line of Eleazar until over in 1 Kings 2 when Zadok becomes the high priest. And once Zadok becomes the high priest in 1 Kings chapter 2, then it's a fulfillment of this and another prophecy here in 1 Samuel that God would change the high priesthood from this family to another family. And that family is to go from Ithamar back to Eleazar, or to go from Eli's descendants over to a man named Zadok. And remember, over in Ezekiel 40 to 48, it will be the sons of Zadok who will be the priests during the millennium. That way we're still with the right descendant. We're still with Eleazar as being the firstborn son of Aaron. That is, the firstborn son who lived through Leviticus chapter 10. But the sons of Zadok will be the priests over in Ezekiel 40 through 48, which will take place during the millennium. Now, verse 35 of this chapter is very similar to verse 10 in that it goes, as Old Testament prophecy often does, way out beyond contemporary events. And again, it's speaking of the Messiah. We'll look at this under Christology of the Old Testament to look at the passages that refer to the Messiah. And I will raise me up a faithful priest that shall do according to that which is in my heart and in my mind. Now, the immediate fulfillment of that is 1 Kings 2 in Zadok. But notice what it said. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before mine anointed forever. Well, Zadok couldn't have lived forever. But Jesus, of course, is the one who will walk forever. Chapter 3, we have Samuel's call. This is very familiar to most people. The call, 4 times, I believe, he's called Samuel, Samuel, and he thinks that Eli is the one calling him. This took place very early one morning. We know that from 1 Samuel 3 and verse 3, where it says, and ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, 1 Samuel 3:3. Well, that's referring to the lampstand, the golden lampstand that had 7 lamps that came out from it. And every evening they had to fill the bowls of the lamps up with oil that would be enough to last it almost all the way through the night until the morning. And in the morning they had to fill them up again. They would last until the evening, and then you fill them up again. So he's giving us a hint as far as what time of night or what time of day it is from verse 3. Ere the lamp of God went out in the temple. In other words, it means just before the lamp of God was going out in the temple, which would have been very, very early in the morning. The oil, in other words, would just about have burned out. And it mentions that because what God's going on to say to him, that there's going to be a new type of oil that he's going to raise up. That is the anointing that he puts upon Samuel. Verse 19, Samuel grew, the Lord was with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. Verse 20, and all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. The Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Now that phrase from Dan to Beersheba is a very common geographical designation in reference to the whole country of Palestine. Dan is practically the northernmost city, and Beersheba the southernmost. So we would say, from north to south, they just say from Dan to Beersheba. In other words, that means all the land of Palestine. I've got some places where you see that. Judges 20 and verse 1, 2 Samuel 3:10, 2 Samuel 17:11, 1 Kings 4:25. That was a common geographical designation to refer to all of Palestine, from Dan to Beersheba. Chapter 4, we have Israel's defeat, the hands of the Philistines. They have gotten to such a place, still during the time of the Judges, they have gotten to such a place that they become superstitious over the ark. They think that the ark has some type of magical connotation to it. That's why whenever they're in trouble in their battle here, they say, bring us the ark, which was something God did not want them to do. He wanted them to trust in him as the invisible king of Israel and not have to rely on some piece of wood, even though he established that to be the place where he himself would manifest himself unto Israel. They had gotten to a place of superstition, thinking that if they brought the ark into their midst, it would somehow add to their power. Now, the Philistines, of course, thought the same thing, because in verses, in verse 5, when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang out. Now, this is why they get a little upset here. The Philistines, of course, become afraid down there in verse 7. Well, here's one of those things that we need to mention, one of the most minor things. You've got God in the singular in verse 7, but it should be in the plural because it's in the plural in both times in verse 8. And it shouldn't be a capital G. There are no gods capital G. There are just gods small g. There's only one God capital G. But this God's plural just represented the pagan connotations of the deity as far as the Philistines were concerned. They worshiped many gods, so they assumed that there were many gods. So that's why they have that written there. The end of the chapter, of course, Eli hears the news. He's 98 years old. We read that verse last time, verse 18. He's sitting on one of the judgment seats, falls off backwards, breaks his neck, and his daughter-in-law goes into labor about this time and has a son, and she dies in labor. So you see all types of things, evil things are happening here to Israel because they are so far from God at this time. And as she goes, she gives the name Ichabod. What does Ichabod mean? The glory has departed. Very interesting name. Something that you wouldn't want to name a child, that's for sure. But it just symbolized the time. Ichabod. The glory of God had departed. In chapter 5, we have the ark among the Philistines. They have all types of problems once they obtain the ark. There were 5 cities of the Philistines. There were 5 lords and 5 cities. That's why they give the particular type of ransom. It was a religious ransom payment they give in chapter 6, hoping that God would forgive them for tampering with the ark as they did. And these cities are located down in this region. This is where the Philistines live, and this is the particular territory that they are in control of. Those cities are mentioned in verse 17 of chapter 6. But they become prominent throughout the narrative, especially over during the time of David. But you can get those from that particular passage there. Now in chapter 6, we've got several interesting things. Here they decide to send the ark back to Israel. Now Israel has been superstitious over the ark, and the Philistines, in their pagan minds, have been superstitious over the ark. But nonetheless, God's power and presence still was with the ark. Because whenever it got into the temple of Dagon there, of course, he fell down, and finally his hands were cut off there. Supernaturally. Hands just sliced off. And as a result, they've got a whole plague that is sent among the Philistines. And so in chapter 6, they decide it's about time that we be packing the ark back up and sending it back to the Israelites. So this is what they do in verse 7. They say, "Now therefore make a new cart and take 2 milk kine," these are of course females here, "on which there hath come no yoke, and tie the kine to the cart, and bring their calves home from them." Now, no mother cow in her right mind is going to walk to Israel and leave her little ones behind her. That's why this is mentioned and stressed here. And that's why, well, let's see, it goes on to say, that's why it says in verse 12, "The kine took the straight way to the way Beth-shemesh, and went along the highway, lowing as they went." I mean, they were upset about having to leave their little ones, but you see, this is by divine supernatural direction, because the whole purpose and the whole plan here is given to us in verse 9, where the Philistines say, if they take the straight way from here to Beth-Shemesh, that shows that God really has fought for them. But if, or that is God's presence really is with the ark, and he's the God in Israel. But if the cows go some other way, then that shows just chance has happened to us. So they put out, in other words, a fleece here. They put out a fleece. These old pagans put out a fleece, and God answered their fleece to show them that he was God. And what's remarkable is that it stresses the fact that these milk kine had young ones with them. But they purposely kept the young ones at home. The mothers just took off. Didn't take any beating to get them to go. No one called in. They took off and headed straight to this little place called Beth-Shemesh. Where it says in verse 12, they went lowing as they went, well, it means just what it says there. Now they come to the city of Beth-Shemesh. Let's see, we've got Shiloh. Now these, I'll mention something else about that here. We've got Shiloh right here. I don't think we have Beth-Shemesh on here. Oh yeah, we do. It's down lower than I thought it was. Here's Beth-Shemesh. Now this, the ark here has been carried around in several places among the Philistines in these 5 cities, like in Gaza and Ekron, and these various cities that they are in control of here on the plain. And it goes right here, you see, right across the border. This red line was the border between Israel and the Philistines at this time. Right across the border to Beth-Shemesh. And this is why in verse 19, we've got, he smote the men of Beth-Shemesh because they looked into the ark of the Lord. Even he smote of the people 50,000 and 70, and the people lamented because the Lord had smitten many of the people with a great slaughter. Now that 50,000 is just wrong. We don't know what it is, but you don't have 50,000 people living in this little backward village, Beth-Shemesh. Chapter 7. They're going to take the ark from Beth-Shemesh up to this place, Kirjath-Jearim, and it's going to stay there for the next 40 or 50 years until the time of David. So with the ark leaving Shiloh, now Kirjath-Jearim doesn't become the religious center, but with the ark leaving Shiloh at this time, Shiloh ceases to be the important religious center. So this is the crux. This is the crux of the story of Shiloh being the important religious center. Whenever the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines and taken from Israel to the land of the Philistines, then Shiloh ceases to be the important religious center in the land. Mizpah, verse 5, follows Shiloh as the important religious center because this is where we always see Samuel gathering the people together at Mizpah, which is another little city down there in southern Palestine, the same general region. They take it to the house of a fellow named Abinadab. You look over in 2 Samuel 6, we see that it's remained there throughout Saul's 40 years and on into some of David's, maybe 50 years. 2 Samuel 6 and 4. They brought the ark, out of the house of Abinadab, which was at Gibeah, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before them. David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments and so forth. Gibeah is in the same region there. Now in chapter 7 we have Samuel's intercession for the people of Israel. On the basis of your outline, this ends the first division of 1 Samuel. Biographical outline, chapters 1 through 7, give us the history of the time of Samuel by himself. Chapter 8, we start with chapter 8 concerning King Saul. Now chapter 8, of course, is probably one of the most important chapters in the Old Testament, along with Deuteronomy 17 as far as the monarchy is concerned. Because it's so important, it would do disservice to the passage and to an understanding of the monarchy for us to even look at that. But just remember 1 Samuel 8, right along with Deuteronomy 17, two of the most important passages on the monarchy. Because this is where the people come and ask Samuel for a king. Samuel prays to the Lord, rehearses their request in the ears of the Lord, and God said, give them just what they've asked for. Howbeit, he does say, let them know what manner of king it'll be that'll rule over them. He'll take their daughters to be cooks and confectionaries. He'll take their sons. He'll take a tenth of what they have, and so forth. And he was right in what he said. Chapters 9 and 10, we have Saul secretly anointed. Saul is secretly anointed by Samuel to be king. This is a familiar story of his lost asses that he has gone to seek, and some of the great demonstrations of the word of wisdom and the word of knowledge. 1 Samuel 9, 1 Samuel 10. Now, since I've heard several of you call a word of wisdom a word of knowledge and a word of knowledge a word of wisdom, let's have a quick quiz. 1 Samuel 9:15, which is it? I've heard several of you call a word of wisdom a word of knowledge. What's verse 15? Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear a day before Saul came, saying, it's a word of wisdom, you're right. A word of wisdom always predicts a future event. Now we've gone over this before, but since I've heard some of you say just the opposite, we need to mention it here. What's verse 20? As for thine asses that were lost 3 days ago, set not thy mind on them, they are found. Word of knowledge. Word of knowledge is always either past or present. Word of wisdom is future. Word of knowledge is past or present. Now I think we looked at these passages in the gifts of the Spirit. 1 Samuel 9 and 10, so we can skip over those two chapters. He is secretly anointed, though, to be king. Comes back home, remember, his uncle asked him, what did Samuel tell you? And he said, well, he told me that the asses were found. But the commentary goes on to say, he spake not to him concerning the matter of the kingdom. Didn't want anyone to know ahead of time. See, Saul starts off, friends, as a good man. He's very humble, very meek and humble individual. But he just oversteps his bounds in several areas, gets lifted up with pride and several other things, and of course it results in his expulsion from the kingship. Chapter 11, we have Saul's first testing. This is the first battle he fights against the Ammonites. Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh-Gilead. Now, where have we seen Jabesh-Gilead before? And let me ask you this, and why do you think, remember that Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, so he's a Benjamite. Really, two questions. Where have we seen Jabesh-Gilead before, and why would Saul perhaps, we're not told this, but why would he perhaps have some type of personal feeling for Jabesh-Gilead? Okay? When was this? Okay, you're thinking back too early there. No, that's not Jabesh-Gilead. Right, they were the only town, Judges chapter 21, that didn't send men to fight against the Benjamites. Remember, they said, take a count, take a number, and whatever town did not send men to fight against the Benjamites in that great civil war there in the end of the book of Judges, we'll go and slaughter all the men and all the women that have known men by lying with them, and we'll save all the virgins. How many virgins? 400. They got 400 virgins and gave them to 400 Benjamites. Otherwise, the Benjamites, remember, would have been wiped out. Now, what probably took place is these 400 men, in a later time, went back to Jabesh-Gilead to live there rather than live where they lived at that time. And, of course, this was some time before this now, because, remember, that goes back to the very beginning of the book and the period of the Judges. Jabesh-Gilead, that's over in Judges 21. So since Saul is a Benjamite, the people from Jabesh-Gilead are Benjamites. And they are the ones threatened here to be destroyed by Nahash, who's king of the Ammonites. And that's why Saul is in a hurry. These are his own brethren there. And you see, he could have not been on the scene if what took place in Judges 21 hadn't taken place, because we wouldn't have any more Benjamites around. So that's where we saw Jabesh-Gilead before, and that's why Saul has a particular inclination towards helping the people. Now he is victorious here. This was his first, what we could call his first trial or his first testing. He is victorious. Then in chapter 12 we have Samuel's long address to the people. Then in chapter 13 we have Saul's first disobedience. And this is where we need to mention something that the critics always mention about 1 Samuel, and that is the problem of the alleged double accounts of everything. There are about 6 events that take place in 1 Samuel that are given to us first in one chapter and then again in another chapter. Now this is what's called a doublet. They call this a doublet, where really it's the same event, but they've drawn from 2 different sources. And it's the same event, such as David's introduction to Saul was included in 2 different sources, and whoever finally put Samuel together drew from both sources, got confused, and ended up with it in one chapter and in another chapter, which we know they're not doublets at all. They're there because they're supposed to be there, and because they actually did take place. Let me give you the doublets that we find in 1 Samuel. First of all, the prophecy of the fall of Eli's house, chapter 2 and chapter 3. And they allege that these come from 2 different sources, known as source criticism here. Now, of course, it's prophesied twice here, but that doesn't mean it came from 2 different sources. Then, secondly, Saul becoming king, chapters 8 through 12. We see him anointed twice. And, of course, very obviously, one of those was a private anointing, and one of them was a public anointing. But the critics say, well, they've gotten confused. They've taken this from sources, and really we have the same event. Then we have Saul's rejection, chapter 13, chapter 15. There's a lot of them found here in the books while they major on the doublets. Then this is the best one and the most important one, I guess. This is David's introduction to Saul, chapter 16, chapter 17. You've read those carefully enough. David's been playing as a musician in Saul's court for some time. And as soon as he wins that battle against Goliath, Saul says, "Who is that? I want to meet him." Why, he's been playing for him for we don't know how long. So how can he ask for a formal introduction when he already knows David? He's his own musician. So they see a problem there. Then David's flight to Achish, king in Gath, chapter 21, chapter 27. Then David sparing Saul's life, chapter 24, chapter 26. And then one I don't have down, but I remember that we could add, would be Saul's death. 1 Samuel 31, 2 Samuel 1. 2 accounts of Saul's death. Which one is right? The last chapter of 1 Samuel, you already know the account there. The first chapter of 2 Samuel. Okay, that brings us back to chapter 13, Saul's first disobedience. Now this transparency that we have here is to show you what the kingdom of Saul comprised. Red line here. These 2 middle portions here, of course they have not taken at this time. Notice how all the coast here, they're completely secluded from the coast. It's controlled by the Philistines in the plain of Philistia and the plain of Sharon, and it's controlled by the Zidonians or the Phoenicians up here in the Phoenician plain here. And so this is all that Saul had. Extended a little bit over into the eastern section of Palestine, but the Philistines were the great warriors that control this. Now, whenever we come to David's time, you see David is going to extend a lot more than this. Saul is the first one who begins to organize the kingdom. Well, we hadn't had a kingdom before this. So he's the first king of the kingdom, and he's got to begin to get things organized. And this is the territory that Saul's kingdom covered. Now, chapter 13 and verse 1, is probably the most difficult verse in 1 Samuel. And the way we've got it in most manuscripts, we just don't know what to do with. The way we've got it in most manuscripts is found in your margin. And because the King James translators knew that couldn't be right, they invented their own thing and put it in the text. But look in your margin. It says that Saul was the son of 1 year in his reigning. Now, anytime you're called the son of the year, that simply is the Hebrew way of giving your age. That means you're 1 year old. If you are a son of 3 years, that doesn't mean that Mr. 3 years is your father, but if you're a son of 3 years, it means you're 3 years old. Now, the manuscripts all say that Saul was the son of the year. But notice it says that he reigned whenever he was the son of the year. Well, he couldn't be king when he was 1 year old. And it says, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, then Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel. Well, let me give you as much as we know of what this verse should say. It shouldn't say anything that you got there in verse 1. What it should say is this. We've got 2 blanks in the sentence that we don't know what goes in there. Saul was blank years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 2 blank years over Israel. We don't know if it was 2 and 20 or 2 and 4. Or maybe not another number. Maybe 2 and something else there. We don't know. But by means of textual criticism, we can reconstruct the verse saying just what I said, which is much closer to what it means than what we find there in verse 1. I mean, the way they've given it to us in verse 1, what does that tell us? Saul reigned 1 year, and when he reigned 2 years over Israel. Why do you even have to say Saul reigned 1 year? If he reigned 2 years, we know he reigned 1. So see, that doesn't make any sense to put that in there. Saul reigned 1 year, and then he reigned 2 years. But it's because he didn't know what to do. Also in verse 5, we got 30,000 chariots. That should be 1,000. They didn't have 30,000 chariots, that's for certain. If all you have is 6,000 horsemen, then you certainly can't have 30,000 chariots. I mean, 30,000 chariots is an unreal number. That's why many of the numbers here in 1 Samuel are extremely high. They're too high, as a matter of fact. A lot of them should be scaled down. Now, don't run through there and look at every high number and scale it down, because you'll miss the point there. But there are certain ones that need to be scaled down. Well, his sin here in chapter 13 is seen in verses 11 and 12. And that is his offering of sacrifice. That was something he should not have done, being king. That was the priest's duty, to offer the sacrifice. And now we see some evil coloring into Saul's personality, because he tells us just a lie in verse 12, I forced myself and offered a burnt offering. Well, don't tell us you forced yourself. It's like saying I forced myself to commit adultery. You didn't force yourself. You willingly did that. But it sounds better if you say, I was compelled to do it, or I forced myself to do it. He didn't force himself. He did it because that's what he wanted to do. Also in verse 21, now this was something that was discovered by means of archaeology, and that's why verse 21 has been obscure until recently. The very beginning of verse 21, yet they had a file for the mattocks. Well, that's not what it says. It says the charge was a pim. A pim was a certain weight of money. And you see, at this time, the Philistines have a monopoly on iron. And any time the Israelites want to sharpen, their lawnmower blade, they have to go to the Philistines to get it sharpened. And of course, Saul and Jonathan are the only 2 ones, I believe, that even have a spear out of all the people. That is an iron one. They are the only 2 that have this. But the beginning of verse 21 should read, the charge was a pim for the mattocks and for the coulters. Now, if you want to know what all those things are, you can look those up. Those are various instruments of iron. Chapter 14. We have Jonathan's victory. He and his armor bearer go up and kill 20 men all by themselves. They again put out a fleece, and they say, Jonathan told his armor bearer, if the Philistines say, come up here and we'll show you a thing, then we'll go up, because that's the Lord telling us that he'll give us the victory. And sure enough, as soon as the Philistines saw them, they said, well, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the caves and the rocks. And they said, come up here and we'll show you a thing. In other words, we'll teach you a lesson. We'll kill you. And he and his armor bearer, verses 13 and 14, in a half acre of land, slay 20 of the Philistines. Verse 18, another one that needs to be changed, of chapter 14. Saul said unto Ahiah, so now we've got another priest on the scene here, bring hither the ephod. They weren't supposed to move the ark. The ark stayed where it was, remember, all the way over to 2 Samuel. The ark stayed there. Bring hither the ephod, for he wore the ephod at that time before Israel. Now do you see, we're just marking out whole verses here in Samuel. That's because we've got corrupt manuscripts. But by means of textual criticism and archaeological discoveries, you can get back at least a portion of what the original meaning was. So he wore an ephod, for he wore the ephod at that time before Israel. Verse 41 is another one that needs to be changed, but it's just too long to get into that, so we'll just save that for that class when we come to that. We'll go back over all these verses again. But verse 41 leaves out whole paragraphs there in what needs to be said in verse 41. Then in chapter 15, we have Saul's second disobedience. This was his failure to kill Agag, who was king of the Amalekites. Samuel had to take that honor upon himself to kill Agag. They reserve Agag along with some of the best of the spoil, because Saul says this belongs to the Lord, where the Lord had said destroy everything and everyone. So we've got his first disobedience in chapter 13 and his second one here in chapter 15. But it's two disobediences. For both of these, afterward Samuel comes to him and says that you've been rejected. Of course, in chapter 15 is the final rejection of Saul as being king. Chapter 13 was just a preliminary rejection. Chapter 15, he says, you are rejected from being king. Verse 22 is your memory text. Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. An often quoted text. God doesn't want all your works. He just wants your obedience, not your religious works that you have to offer to him that thinks that's pleasing to him. Just do what he tells you to do, and he'll be satisfied. Well, in closing, we're going to close with this chapter, but I'll leave you with the problem. Let's see, let me find the verses. Verse 11, verse 29, and verse 35. You can look them up when you get home. That's a problem for theology to deal with, those verses, though. Everyone's looking right now, I can tell. You can read them when you get home, and you'll see the problem. Mm-hmm. Pardon? It says twice there he repented, and right in the middle of the chapter it says he won't repent. Hallelujah. Praise God. Blessed be the Lord. He who is mighty. We got that from Mary's prophecy.